We should be live on YouTube. Just give me a second. We should be live on YouTube. Okay, I've muted the YouTube channel and now I will let folks in. All right, the first few participants are entering the room. Hello, folks. No need to crowd. There's plenty of seats for everyone.
See one of our previous speakers there.
Looks like our numbers are stabilizing. So with that, I'll say hello, everybody. Welcome to yet another of this series of historical talks, the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. Assuming that's what you've come here for, you're in the right place. If you think you're here for something else, you may have wandered into the wrong Zoom webinar, but why not stay anyway, because it'll probably be entertaining and you may learn something. So without further ado, I'm your host, the Executive Director of RASC, Phil Groff, and I'd like to introduce on my panel with me here tonight, we've got Randall Rosenfeld, Chris Beckett, and of course our speaker for the evening, Clark Muir. So with no further ado, I will just point out that there is a chat function that you can find at the bottom of your screen. And that's one place you can use to communicate with each other. I'll remind you that when you do turn on the chat function, the default is that you're only communicating with the panelists. If you'd like to speak with anyone else, you have to change the little blue tab there, the little pull down window from panelists to panelists and attendees. And then you can type into the chat and have everyone see it like this. There is also a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can leave questions for our speaker that will be relayed to him to address either during the course of the talk or at the end of it, whichever he prefers. Okay, well, with that, I think our numbers are reasonably solid. YouTube seems to be functioning correctly. So with that, I will turn things over to our speaker for this evening, Clark Muir, to tell us about this exciting murder mystery.
Thanks, Phil. It's normally in the last 5 months I normally introduce the speaker, but since I am the speaker tonight, I'll spare you that part of it. Let me share my screen. And slideshow. All right, hopefully you can see, can someone confirm that they can see the first page?
Can't see it yet, Clark.
Okay, I'll try it again, sorry.
There you go. Looks good.
Is that better?
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. All of this started rather innocently. Several years ago, I wrote the article and it appeared in the Journal of the RASC. I had wondered what was written about Alvan Graham Clark after his death. And that was a result because of the timing. As many of you will know, he died at a rather remarkable coincidental moment just after he'd finished a major project. And when I started digging, I found a remarkable story. And when I investigated further, it got even more bizarre. And at some point I decided this had to be written. Now, especially today, we know
Clark.
that the,
Hey, Clark,
yes,
you're in presenter mode. So
Yes.
I'm not sure if you need your notes or not, but if you switch over to display mode,
okay,
somebody just mentioned that.
I see what I've done. Hang on. I had it before.
Yeah, I think you had it right when we were testing it at the beginning.
That's weird.
Yeah, sometimes it does that.
All right, let me try again. Still on presenter mode, or are we?
Don't see it yet. Don't see it yet.
Okay. I'm trying to flip my screens.
Yeah.
All right, okay, let's try this.
It's always something, eh?
Yeah.
There's always one little glitch when we're doing these. I'll get this sorted out here in a second.
Is that any better?
We still don't see it.
That's bizarre.
Yeah. Yeah, somebody wants to tell a joke. This is the part where Randall's hedgehog needs to come alive and do a dance routine.
I'm afraid he's on strike, actually.
He's is he? I thought he was on a 12-inch Dobsonian.
He is, but he's still on strike.
Henry, you can't leave us hanging here. You've got to finish that
Yeah,
joke there in the
that's what
chat
I'm trying to figure out. Why? You can see my notes, and I'm trying to flip the screens, and I don't know how to do that.
Well, showing it in presenter mode, if people make their screens full size on their display, at least they'll still see the slides as most of the screen.
Can you see that?
No,
Oh,
we
dear.
don't. Yeah, we don't see
Okay.
anything.
What's the punchline, Peter? I assume everyone can see what Peter Broughton just.
Yes. Very good. All right. All right.
Well, I can't complain because so far Peter's adding more than I am.
Oh.
But it's funny, Henry. He's very coy. Doesn't speak all that often. I was actually selling him by mistake as a hedgehog.
Are we any closer?
No.
Because I'm supposed to be sharing my screen.
Yeah, we're there.
There you go.
Yeah,
Perfect.
now play it.
Are we
Yep,
there?
perfect. That'll do. It'll do.
Yeah, it's still presenter mode, but
Okay.
That's fine.
Okay, so it's, sorry about that. anyways, with current popularity of true crime, I'm surprised on social, on things like Netflix, on streaming networks, and on cable television. I'm surprised that this topic hasn't come up. So I thought I would start with a quick introduction. Many of you will know some of this, but for the rest, it'll give us a strong introduction as to who they are. Now, it starts with an obituary of Alvan Graham Clark, and the obituaries are excellent sources to get information about scientists. It gives you the names, of course, of their relatives, their parents, their spouses, children, and gives you the proper spelling. And they claim that the manufactory started in about 1850. But this headline from the Chronicle in April 14th, 1860 says that a new observatory will be built by Alvan Clark, Esquire, of this city, and has purchased about 2 acres of land near Pine Grove. Now, Pine Grove is what we now know as Cambridge. And we'll start here. This is a famous photograph taken in the 1870s of the 3 men. The middle one is Alvan Clark Sr. To the left is Alvan Graham Clark and his brother George Bassett Clark. The 3 of them started the firm, and 1860 would catapult them, or 1862 would catapult them into legend status. I wanted to show a map of Cambridge, sometimes called Cambridgeport. Now, this map is from 1916, but it's close enough. We see the southern part of the city. We see the Charles River on the bottom and on the left. And we see some buildings with red on them. I believe those are commercial. I want you to look on the right-hand side of the screen about center. And we see that's where the Clark property was. If I go closer, we see the manufactory on the left, on the right rather. Do you see the little square right here? That's a Hastings Square. It's a park that still exists, and it helps us identify the property because it happens to be kitty corner of the Clark property. Also on the bottom, you'll see an area called Captain's Island down along the river. Although it's changed names, I think it's called Magazine Beach or something like that. It still exists. And finally, a close-up of that same map gives us a better idea of the property. We see the large red building, which is the manufacturing plant. The 2 buildings on the left are houses. One was built after the other. And there's also 2 squares between the houses. One of them is the observatory, and the other one is probably the tester mount. And at this point also, look at 1916, the property adjacent to the Clarks is owned at that time by the Ford Motor Company. Now, finally, I found this just recently. This is what they call a bird's eye view sketch of Cambridge. It was done in 1877. It shows a sketch, actually, of the entire city. It would have been enormous. And this was done by pencil. So if you look closely at that circle area, we see the sketch done to scale of the Clark factory. The building, this building here on the right is the manufacturing buildings. We see the observatory, the 2 houses, and a strange looking thing that's probably the tester mount. Now keep in mind, if it's to scale, that thing's enormous. It's what 2 or 3 stories high. So that I found recently. And so here's where we start. And this is a well-known story. In January 31st in 1862, we know that Series B was discovered by accident while Alvan G. Clark was testing the optics of a new 18.5-inch refractor at his factory in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That telescope was originally slated for the University of Mississippi, but when the Civil War came in, they had to find a new buyer. And now it's in Chicago. George Phillips Bond confirmed the discovery using the 15-inch Harvard refractor about a week later. And the picture of the that you see there is the one I took while I had visited the Adler Museum, Adler Planetarium in Chicago, and it shows the telescope at the eyepiece. And finally, a quote from Alvan Graham Clark there, and an image of Sirius and Sirius B taken by NASA. So that would have been an early success of Alvan Graham Clark and the manufacturing, and there's no question that today it's the beginning of a legend. I don't know if at the time that discovery was as big news, but we understand today that it is. This headline comes from the New York Times on November 9th, 1894. And it's what they're doing is they're going to test the largest lens yet. They're testing the 40-inch that's scheduled to go to the Yerkes Observatory. Now, this was a test done with George E. Hale present, an unnamed physicist that I believe I found the name, Alvan Clark, and his assistant, which is unnamed in the article, is Carl London. There was also a representative of the Transcript newspaper. So George E. Hale is a very important figure, as some of you might know. He was responsible for the construction of the Yerkes Observatory, and I believe convinced Charles Yerkes to donate money to the building of that observatory and telescope. So somehow I suspect he must have been told that Alvan Clark was going to test the mirror, and he made his way to Boston if he wasn't already there. So they had a test where they looked at some stars. As they're testing optics, they'll send it in and out of focus and check the lens that way. But they also looked at some double stars, something that Clark was well known for. And the writer said that they looked at red stars, white stars, and blue stars, and thought that it was patriotic. But once that was done, they turned the optics to Mars and were incredibly able to find the outer moon Deimos. It was detected in the optics. I want to note that that was discovered by Asaph Hall. The Mars moons were discovered by Asaph Hall 20 years earlier, probably in the 1870s. And I also point out that the Mars opposition that year in 1894 was similar to the opposition of Mars we had in October. Also present were three of Clark's, well, they said that the fair members of his family, and it had to be his daughters because that was the only family he had. And they also, I introduce them now because they're a part of the story. At the top, we have Alvan Graham Clark, 1832, 1897, and his wife, Mary Willard Clark. They had 4 children. Caroline Clark was the oldest, and her date of birth is there. Elizabeth Clark was second, although I don't have her year of birth. And Mary Theodora Clark was the youngest of the 3 girls. Alvan Clark was a son, but died in 1885 in his youth. And I learned that he was being trained or groomed to take over the business, but his premature death stopped that. So for our story in 1897, it's the 3 girls that will tell the story. So as that 40-inch lens is being delivered in May 1897, it was meticulously packed in a Wagner Palace car from Boston to Albany, and then through many other train companies, it arrived safely at Yerkes Observatory in Williams Bay, Wisconsin on May 19th, 1897. Both Alvan Clark and his assistant Carl London were escorting the train. The lens was installed to the top of the telescope, or on the telescope rather, on May 20th, 1897. So this is the picture that is also iconic, and it shows Carl London polishing the lens and Alvan Clark standing by it. Now, I note the date that came from the Yerkes Observatory archives. The photograph date is alleged of May 11th, 1897. Now, it's a small discrepancy, but unless I'm missing something, I think because the lens arrived in Yerkes on the 19th, that picture had to be taken a week later, either on the 19th or the 20th. But in any case, this would be, if not the last photo taken of Alvan Clark, it's definitely one of the last. And again, it is an iconic one. When they tested they gave first light to the 40-inch in Yerkes. The story here is that the astronomers were looking at Jupiter. The first person to look through the telescope was the president of University of Chicago, William Harper. So he takes a look at Jupiter. Other observers that night included George E. Hale, E. Bernard, and James E. Keeler. Now, I believe James E. Keeler was also at the test in Cambridge 3 years earlier. All three of these men, by the way, are honorary members of the RASC. And they also they tested it for the next few nights when it was clear. So Jupiter, and then they mentioned M27, M13, M57, globular cluster, and a couple of planetary nebulas that were also observed through the lens, and naturally everything was wonderful. Now we have to talk about the accident. According to Hale, it happened at exactly 6:43 a.m. But on the morning of Monday, May 29th, 1867, the south side of the rising floor of the Great Observatory collapsed, and the spiral stairway was partly damaged. You know, I've never been to this observatory, but I imagine that must have been a remarkable accident. Though no one was injured, E. Bernard and another astronomer, Ferdinand Ellerman, were observing just hours before the collapse. And equally miraculous, the great telescope seemed to suffer no harm. So there was no damage to the optics. Apparently, a construction of a new platform had to be obviously rebuilt, and it was completed by 1897, and this would have delayed the grand opening. So where was Clark in all of this? It is unclear to me, and I don't know if there's any notes on this. It's unclear when Clark learned of the event, whether he had traveled back to Boston or was still in town, or if he perhaps rushed back to see what could be done. But I noted in a June 5th, 1897 article, in the Cambridge Tribune, it suggested that Clark was lucky his life's work was not destroyed in the accident. On June 9th, just 4 days later, Alvan Graham Clark was dead. I wanted to talk about the funeral a little bit. And as I mentioned earlier, the funerals are great places to get information, rather obituaries. He was married to Mary Willard Clark, who died on July 10th, 1892. Apparently he died early in the afternoon at his home on Brookline Street, where his factory is, on June the 9th, 1897. He was survived by 3 daughters, and we already discussed his son Alvan. Now, he had mentioned eclipse expeditions that he witnessed in his obituary, which is a bit odd because when we think about Alvan Clark, his eclipse experiences are way down the list. I had learned that he had been to one in 1870 in Spain, but I had also remembered the eclipse in the Western United States in 1878. He was in Rawlins, Wyoming, I believe, and there were several people there, including Thomas Edison. Now, there was other eclipse expeditions for that eclipse nearby in Creston, for example. The funeral service was at the house. They had a small service in the house and at the Austin Street Unitarian Church. The pallbearers included Professor Pickering. That would have been Edward Pickering, I'm sure. Pickering had a brother. Percival Lowell, who's well known. Asa of Hall, who was the discoverer of the 2 Mars moons we talked about, and a few other people. For example, Alvan Sortwell, I learned, was a former mayor of the city of Cambridge. And Harris Joseph Willard is undoubtedly related to Alvan Clark's wife. And finally, an hour at his workshop was an unusual pleasure, both as a scientific man as well as the ordinary individual, and no one was ever turned away. There are a handful of stories of people writing about their experiences visiting the observatory and how well they were treated, inviting them into his shop and showing them a few things about how the instruments were made. That obituary is from O.C. Wendell and appeared about a week after his death. So there's something that was uncovered about Alvan Clark before the Yerkes lens was delivered. And I'll just read it. It comes from the Cambridge Tribune in June 12, 1897. Very few persons outside of the family were aware of Mr. Clark's ill health, and his recent trip to the West with the lenses for the big Yerkes telescope naturally tended to give the impression that Mr. Clark was in good physical condition. Some months ago, Mr. Clark's condition evidenced an inherited apoplectic tendency, and just before starting for the West, he was temporarily prostrated, although he apparently recovered to his usual health. He had probably suffered a minor stroke. I know that I believe his brother died from a stroke, and he had a sister that also died from a stroke. So the sense is that he probably felt he was vulnerable to having one. So apparently he was laid in bed before delivering the telescope to Wisconsin. So now I'm going to introduce the Clark spouses of the three daughters, and this is where we're going to get into the mystery. Carolyn Clark's the oldest. She was married in 1892 to a man named Professor Charles Eastman. Charles Eastman was a professor of zoology at Harvard, and a little bit more on his biography a little later. The middle daughter, Elizabeth Clark, married in 1893 a gentleman named Richard Grogan. The Clarks had apparently horses at a stable, and Richard Grogan was the stable owner's son, and the two young men and women fell in love and got married. The young daughter, finally, Mary Theodora Clark, married Sumner R. Hollander in 1896 or possibly 1897. Sumner R. Hollander was the son of a wealthy merchant who was apparently one of the most well-respected families in all of Massachusetts. So these are the big players from here on in. Now, shortly after Clark's death, and I told you I was looking to see what happened, what was written about him, I found this story. It's a remarkable story, and it's confusing and complicated. It's called the Kidnappings. It appeared in the San Francisco Call, April 16, 1898. And all those headlines come from the same story. And what I'll do is there's so many highlights, I'll just go through them bullet point. The story alleges that Mary Theodora, she's the youngest daughter of Clark, was abducted twice over the course of several months. Her husband, Sumner R. Hollander, returned home from work one night, probably in late 1897, to find his wife, Theodora, missing. She had been recovering from an illness that kept her bedridden with nurses attending. They couldn't find her anywhere. So the Hollander family, they were wealthy merchants and well-respected through the state of Massachusetts. They hired detectives to find her. And incredibly, she was found hiding in rural North Dakota. So they returned home and things were getting back to normal. And Mary Theodora apparently became very seriously ill again. On March 2nd, 1898, Mr. Hollander went away for 2 nights in business and returned again to find her missing a second time, again with no trace. After hiring detectives, she was found this time in a ranch near Willows, California. Apparently, the kidnappers were tipped off, so they left the ranch before Mary Theodora was found. However, a few days later, she was reunited with her husband, Sumner Hollander, at a San Francisco hotel. Now, some of this story cannot be corroborated, but it was written. Was she really kidnapped, or was she trying to flee her husband? All of these are questions that need to be answered, and some of them, frankly, can't be. Also in the article, the same article, there's a dispute over the will of Alvan Graham Clark. Apparently, his will was a catalyst for the controversy and was a turning point in the young Hollander couple's lives. The youngest daughter of Alvan Clark, Mary Theodora, was to receive the bulk of her father's estate, roughly valued at $250,000. Meanwhile, the other $2 were either disinherited from the will or given a small monetary sum. Now, again, this cannot be corroborated, but it is clear that this will, whatever is in it, caused friction over many years between the daughters and their spouses. One story, this was in the New York Sun only 3 days after the story you just heard appeared in the paper, is that Sumner R. Hollander is suing Professor Eastman, the other spouse of the Clark daughter, of Harvard, for $150,000. And it is alleged that he's filed 2 suits, Eastman of Harvard and Mrs. Eastman, in an action of tort with damages of $150,000, alleging conspiracy, abduction, and alienation of his wife's affections. Paradoxically, Mrs. Hollander is the daughter of Alvan Clark, says that she is a victim of blackmail on the part of her husband and seeks protection from him. She is now staying in California with friends of Professor Eastman, whose wife is her sister. So what is going on? Either Sumner Hollander probably believes that Professor Eastman has interfered and coerced his wife, young wife, into leaving him and hiding. It's not clear what happened, but all of that research leads into this. It's July 4th, 1900. And that, of course, is Independence Day for the United States, the celebrations. Richard Grogan and Charles Eastman spent the day at the Clark estate where they lived. It was a hot day, and the men with their families may have walked to Captain's Island. Remember, I showed you on the map. That was on that day throughout the city and certainly throughout the country, there were events going on. They included swimming races, there was fireworks in the evening, bands playing, and so forth. Generally, it is believed the 2 men were friends, and apparently they had dined together. They called it dinner, but about 2 o'clock. And later, Eastman and Grogan adjourned to the back of the house to continue their target practicing. Apparently, there was a paper target set up on against the observatory wall, like a literally painted bullseye type thing. At about 5:30 p.m., Grogan was shot near his left breast. 8 minutes later, with physicians present, Richard Grogan died. So this is not a very good picture, but it does show the estate. Unfortunately, it shows the observatory against where the target was placed, which is right here. The observatory is seen there. It's a poor scan, I think. The double house where the Eastmans and Grogan families lived is here, and the famous shop where the lens are making is here. So unfortunately, it's not as clear as I would like. So what happened? Well, the district court heard the case on July 18th. Judge Alney was the judge, and he believed that the death was accidental. The government was surprised at this verdict, apparently, but was undecided whether to present evidence at a future grand jury. At this point, the court was overflowing with onlookers. Charles R. Eastman, for now, was a free man. Now, this is in October, so during that time, Eastman has been free. Apparently, he was down working in Arizona doing some work on fossils and whatnot. He came back, but early October, it was decided that the case against Charles Eastman would go to a grand jury. And yeah, so they decided to go to a grand jury with evidence to arraign Charles Eastman. He was arraigned on October 26th at the grand jury. He was charged with murdering Richard H. Grogan Jr. And after a lengthy reading of the charges, Eastman says he was not guilty either of all that charge or any part of it. Now, at that point, the police insisted that they had a network of evidence, and they believed that they would find Charles Eastman guilty of the death of his brother-in-law. What that evidence was, I do not know. So the grand jury, October 26, 1900, Eastman was quietly brought into the Superior Courtroom, arraigned on the charge of murdering his brother-in-law, Richard H. Grogan. No public announcement was made of the hearing due to all sides desiring no publicity and to prevent the courtroom from being overrun with, in quotation marks, curious spectators. Nonetheless, a crowd had been hanging around the courthouse for days, waiting for the proceedings. Eastman was to be held without bail in the county jail until the time of his trial and during that period. So from October 26th, he's in prison, waiting for the trial. The defense strategy appears. One of the things that happened on July 4th that I should have mentioned is that yes, they were firing pistols. And apparently it's hard to know what happened because the different stories cannot be corroborated. But at one point, the one pistol was an antique. The other one was new. And the antique was misfiring and was rusty and all of those things. So it was alleged that one of three things could have happened. Either Eastman did it deliberately, Eastman shot him accidentally, or it was an accident where somehow the revolver went off and Grogan shot himself. So those are the three choices. But anyways, the argument was originally from the defense that it was an accidental shooting, presumably that Eastman shot him by accident. When the big trial starts, the defense may substitute for one of self-defense. Curiously, there was a ragged hole in the cap that Eastman was wearing on the day of the shooting. It was originally explained that Grogan shot a Roman candle, one of the fireworks perhaps on the July 4th that they might have been shooting. However, it is established, if it was established it was a bullet, it could be evidence of an exchange of fire and maybe a self-defense. So we get to the trial. The trial finally formally starts on April 22, 1901. The most interesting, it is considered to be the most interesting murder trial in recent history of Cambridge. Jurors are selected from a pool of about 160 persons, with about 100 witnesses expected to testify. That number I learned just the other day. It seems high. I had thought closer to 40, but nonetheless, there is a lot of witnesses, and it'll become clear why. On the 23rd, opening remarks by counsel. On the 24th, it is ruled that the dying statement of Richard Grogan cannot be was inadmissible. The next day, or the 26th, Carl London takes the stand. He's an important figure, but not necessarily in this story. He may have been just taking the stand to sort of acknowledge that the two men had a good relationship. On April 30th, evidence of the bullet found in Grogan's body is presented, and we'll get into that. And finally, on May 8th, just before the end of the trial, Charles Eastman takes the stand in his own defense. So, Charles Eastman murdered me. The court ruled that the witness cannot repeat Richard Grogan's dying words. Now, it was argued that this was an opinion and not a statement. There was at least 6 witnesses that were prepared to testify that they heard Grogan say that. Now, there would have been different variations. I think I mentioned that from the time he was shot to the time he died, 8 minutes had transpired. And what happened was the children and family were playing in the yard. Some of the Clark's daughters had young children at that time. Several others in the area would have heard the shots while sitting in their nearby piazzas. These are the balconies in their streets, in their homes. Now, keep in mind, it's a very hot day, so people are outside. Or they were in the park, and that possibly refers to the park that's kitty corner to the estate. That's Hastings Square, that's still there. And other things that might have gone on is the streets might have been busy with people going to and from the park and the waterfront for the July 4th celebrations. So even though it was a large 2-acre property that the Clarks owned, there was a lot of commotion, the gunfire and the screaming and so forth. So several people would have heard Richard Grogan say that Charlie Eastman murdered me, or to that effect, but that was not to be mentioned in court. And there's another another story showing the murder scene, albeit not very well, the side of the house, and it looks like they're showing the observatory through a picket fence. Next, we go to the bullet. The bullet in the chest of Grogan that killed him was determined to be from a new modern revolver and not the old disused rusty pistol that was being also used at the same time. It was argued that this fact strengthens the prosecution case, as it was alleged by the defense that the bullet was from the old revolver. This perhaps implies that if the modern revolver were used, it was more likely for the intent to kill. Furthermore, the misfire was alleged to have originated from the old revolver. If the bullet that killed Grogan contained tin, then it must have come from the modern weapon. The old revolver would have strictly lead fragments. And so Professor Wood of Harvard, this story came out on May 1st, that there was tin in the bullet. Testified that he had found tin in the fragment of the bullet taken from Grogan's body, which corresponds with the composition of the center fire bullet. I'm not a gun expert. While the rim fire bullet, the antique revolver, would have been made of pure lead. So we get to the verdict. On May 11th, 1901, we get a verdict of not guilty. There was 5 hours of jury deliberation. Cheers erupted with handkerchiefs and hats being waved in the packed courthouse. Eastman shook hands with the jurors and thanked them for the acquittal. The cheers eventually made it to the streets. Eastman left the courthouse through the back entrance to try and avoid crowds, but nonetheless was greeted by hundreds of spectators. What was the key? Apparently, in one source, it says that Eastman went to his own defense. His own testimony was his strongest defense. He changed the story to note that during a scuffle, somehow Grogan's gun had turned upon himself and inflicted the wound. The motive for the alleged murder was said to be bitterness that existed between the two men. However, there was a massive evidence that the two brother-in-laws were always friendly, and that included testimony from Eastman's own wife, but one imagines that a lot of other people, including people like London, were testifying as to their relationship, who probably would have known both men well. So this story emerged. It's a very strange one as well. It's about Richard Grogan's body was exhumed. It happened, apparently it wasn't reported at the time. Certainly I can't see anything that claimed it was. In early January too, in the dark, at nighttime, the body was exhumed by county officers in order to secure the remainder of the bullet which caused death. And this was the bullet that was examined to determine that it was made of tin and not lead. But that wasn't reported, as I said, at January 2, nor can I recall, did that come out during the trial? Yes, the bullet was inspected, came under trial, but the fact that the body was exhumed didn't. So we first learned that the body was exhumed in a lawsuit by the widow of Richard Grogan, Elizabeth Grogan, and she's suing it for more than $20,000. And the other headline in July 20th said, this case has more than 9 lives as the case refuses to die. So that's the only evidence I have that the body was exhumed, is because the widow sued, and not that it came out in the papers any other way. So here's an interesting quote from the allegation and substance about the exhumed body from the Clark family tomb, and that was at Mount Auburn Cemetery. So the body was interred in Mount Auburn Cemetery in the tomb of the deceased father of the plaintiff, that the defendant Weir and the other defendants on or about January 2, 1901, without the knowledge or consent of the plaintiff and unmindful of their duty to leave undisturbed and untouched the said dead body, which had been properly and reverently interred, willfully, clandestinely, and in secret and by stealth trespassed on the rights of the plaintiffs as the custodian of said body and persons of her said husband, and wickedly violated the rights of the plaintiff and outraged said the body outraged said body and also the plaintiff, and it goes on and on. So then, and then at the end, and was otherwise cruelly and outraged in her mind and was caused great mental suffering. So it's quite a story. And there's no other evidence that the body was exhumed except, as far as I can see, in mentions of the lawsuit. So the aftermath of the trial, endless litigation for more than a decade continued to keep the family in the spotlight. And we've already talked about 2 cases that happened. But since then, since the trial, here's 4 examples, and there's a lot more. And I don't put a date in the first one. Charles Eastman sues Theodora Clark Hollander over the value of the Clark property sold. So this is evidence that there is something on in the will, and they're squabbling over who owns what. Elizabeth Grogan sued Carolyn Eastman for $20,000 in a state and father's will dispute. That was 1912. A year later, this is a sad one, Elizabeth Grogan sued the Eastmans over Rumsford medals that Alvan Clark would have won, I believe, in Europe, and the mother's wedding ring. So they were still squabbling back then. And in another strange one, Hollanders were involved in an auto accident, the youngest couple that killed a child on September 1907. My understanding is that someone was stepping off a streetcar and Sumner Hollander hit the child. Witnesses suggested that he tried in vain to avoid the accident, and so the trial was quick and he was found not guilty. Now, again, this is just a small sampling of the kind of litigation that happened for a long time, and it does suggest that there are obvious problems within the family. So I mentioned Charles Rochester Eastman, and this is what I wrote a few years ago. Before his arrest, Charles R. Eastman taught geology and paleontology at Harvard. Eastman eventually left Harvard to become an instructor at the Carnegie Institute in Pittsburgh. While in Pittsburgh, his wife, Carolyn Clark, filed for divorce in 1916. Later, Eastman worked for the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Eastman was widely known in the scientific community and had written dozens of papers on the fossils of fishes. Finally, he resigned from the museum to work for the War Trade Board in Washington, D.C. After becoming ill with the influenza, there was always an influenza story. In 1918, Eastman went to rest at a Long Island resort in New York. While recovering from his illness there, it is believed that Eastman fell into the ocean in Long Beach. His body was found, and it was determined that he drowned. So that's the story on Eastman. And one note, Elizabeth Grogan remarried after the death of Richard Grogan, her husband, in early 1902 and moved to Philadelphia. So we finally get into the ownership of the property. Obviously, the death of Alvan Clark would have changed things. And since then, I found a cryptic story that insists that an unnamed individual who had long known the Clark family is interested in purchasing the commercial land and the machinery for the lens-making business. It is suggested that Harvard University would be mentioned prominently in the deal. So who could that be, and how serious was this story? We could look at some of the pallbearers who were good Harvard men and were both wealthy and understood the importance of the telescope making business, people like perhaps Lowell and Hall and Pickering and so forth. But it was also considered a setback for the business when Richard Grogan, who took over the business, died. It is my understanding that Richard Grogan at some point bought out the other siblings to take the business over. A couple other notes. Some of these are small. They're not significant, I don't think, but there was the name Randolph C. Bach came up. While he was employed at the firm of Alvan Clark and Sons, he died on May 1st, 1903. He was employed as an operator. Not sure what that is, but they considered it one of the few experts in the field. A tidbit, and I don't know anything else about it, in 1903 says a gentleman named W.L. Watts was the manager of the firm. And a highly speculative comment suggested during a lawsuit within the family, adjacent to that the Ford Motor Company may wish to purchase the Clark property. This in 1913, and for a while the Ford Company was building Model Ts right next door to the Clark the Clark estate. And it was suggested perhaps in a lawsuit to try to maybe suggest that the property was worth more money than it was, that the Ford company would want to buy it to expand their business. Now, it turns out that building is still there and can still be seen. And finally, at Carl London's death in 1915, his son Robert London took over the business, the lens making at the firm. And that part, I believe, has been well documented. So finally, with all the uncertainty, Alvan Clark and Sons was now incorporated. It became incorporated in June 8, 1901, and continued to produce outstanding lenses. In fact, under new life, it was suggested that some of the best work of the company had ever produced was being built during this time frame. With London now at the helm, two 24-inch mirrors for Harvard, a 16-inch lens for the University of Cincinnati, and an 18-inch lens for Amherst College were among the projects completed by the company in the early part of the new century. It was clear that any distractions that the last few years brought the company had been stabilized. So some final comments, conclusions, and questions. First of all, there's still too many questions to be asked or answered, rather. The entire ordeal clearly indicates a dysfunctional relationship between the siblings and their spouses. Motivation for murder was there in traditional sense, the will, the money, and some family grumblings. Curiously, the victim of the kidnapping and her spouse, that's Theodora Clark and Sumner R. Hollander, were not really involved at the murder scene. They might have been there, they might have been testified, but they certainly weren't big players in it. And that's the original story, was that she, the young daughter, was given the estate money. And the court case was clearly a national headliner involving the well-known families of the lens makers and the Harvard professor. So how did the firm continue success? Well, clearly Carl London was the constant. He'd been at the firm since about 1875 and continued to make the lenses. What was written in Alvan G. Clark's will, I don't know. I don't know if anyone knows, but it would certainly clear up some answers. And finally, the big one, did Charles Eastman murder Richard Grogan? And I suppose the second question would be is, if he did, was the verdict correct? And there's still too many details to know for sure, I think. And so finally, I wanted to talk about this. It's got nothing, it's what I found in researching all of this. A mighty cylinder. This is about the great tester mount that was used, at least, well, we highlighted two of those. One when they found Series B, and the other one when they were testing the one for Yerkes. And remember in the obituary, they talked about how people would be invited into the home and were treated with respect and kindness and so forth. And there's stories about people visiting the estate, and they write years later what that experience was like. So a couple of quotes. Overhead towered the great testing tube, a mighty cylinder of iron on a lofty brick pier with a massive equatorial mount. That was published years after Alvan Clark died, in fact, in 1927. But I believe the visit took place in the late 1800s. And another interesting one, also from, I think that was also in Popular Astronomy, but the author was Charles Skeel Palmer. He also visited the site and said that one was never used to its prophetic limit. He's talking about the testing tube. For he told me that it would carry a lens of 50 inches. Now, we know that whether it's practical or theoretical, that the lenses can't get that large. They're just too big. But this was probably a visit in 1882. So if that's correct, the lens would have been able to carry a 50-inch, the tube would have been able to carry a 50-inch lens for testing. And I doubt, certainly didn't get that big. And finally, the big tube in which the Lick glass was tested is still in position on Mr. Clark's grounds. It resembles a neglected smokestack of a deserted factory. The tube slants toward the southeast and is red with rust from exposure and weather. That's an article from the Cambridge Chronicle in 1890. And one last note is the article down here in the bottom. On Henry Street, in a quiet corner of the old port, is located an unpretentious brick building, which, with the famous old trial mounting and its big red tube, mistaken once upon a time for the funnel of a Cunarder gone astray and stranded in the Charles River, is a mecca for astronomy the world over. And we know, of course, Cunarders as being large cruise ships. In those days, there was probably some smaller ones. So it's somewhat amusing that they would have thought it from a distance anyways. It looked like a giant giant smokestack from a Cunard ship. So some of these are quaint, and I quite like them, and I don't know if much is known about these stories. I wanted to mention this. When Richard Grogan's body was exhumed, it was in this tomb. This exists in Mount Auburn Cemetery and is a simple mausoleum to the Clark family. Among the people that are buried in there is Alvan Clark Sr. and his wife, Maria Pease Clark. Alvan Graham Clark is in there. I believe his wife is also there. And Richard H. Grogan and his wife, Elizabeth Clark Grogan. So those are some of the people that are in this modest tomb in Mount Auburn Cemetery. Now, I've never been to Boston. I've been to Massachusetts, but certainly not lately. And if I do go, I would like to go to the Mount Auburn Cemetery. I had found a guide to astronomers that are buried there, and they include people like Wilhelmina Fleming, who has a very simple, remarkably simple gravestone. She was one of the Harvard computers. Nathaniel Bowditch has a statue. He was an early American mathematician and astronomer, and the list goes on. And by the way, George Bassett Clark is also buried, not in here, but in a different tomb within the cemetery. So I just wanted to thank you for that. That's all I have, and I think we'll have time for some questions and answers if I can figure out how to get out of this. So thank you very much.
I feel like there should be a great round of applause, Clark.
Okay.
It was really good.
Thank you.
We have a question there. When you're ready, Clark, just let me know.
Yep, go ahead.
It's from Eric Briggs. Says, was Albany chosen as a rail hub, as a destination for the automobile carrying the Yerkes lens, or as a Erie Canal connection for a gentler ride?
Boy, I think it was rail, from what I read. Yeah, you can find out. George Hale wrote about that. He was the one that gave the dates as to the arrival, and I think it was rail. But even if it went by ship to Chicago, they'd still have to take it to Wisconsin. So to be honest, I'm not 100% sure.
We got something in the Q&A from Henry. He asks, I wonder if the 18-inch lens was tested on the big tube. Don't they talk of cirrus B or cirrus peeking out from the side of a building when they saw cirrus B? So with the 18-inch, for some reason, I thought the 18-inch was tested in the tube, but anyway, maybe you have better information.
Yeah, that was very early on, and I'm not sure, one, if they built a new tester tube, or two, you're right, if it was used that early. But by the 1870s, it was there, and the other telescopes were tested. Whether or not it was that early, that's a good point. That would have only been like within a year of the facility, of the new facility being built. You know, 15 is quite manageable. I think you could probably just test that on a regular mount.
Yeah, somebody wrote there and said the big tube did not exist until later. So yeah, I think we're all kind of on the same page on that one.
That's John Briggs, who knows the stuff very well. John also did the latest inventory for Yerkes,
Oh, wow.
And he'd be a good person to ask. Well, make John, if you want to, we can make you live.
Yeah, let's bring him
John,
on.
that was my great rival as director of a telescope museum. Actually, no, John's a good friend.
Here we go. Welcome, John. We can see you. Just need to unmute. There you go.
Hi. It's thank you so much for the cool presentation. I had along with friends in the Antique Telescope Society, I had heard about this murder and knew a little bit about it, but I, for one, had never had the time or resources to look into it like you have. And of course, it just continues to present curiosities and mysteries, but man, what a mess. Many of us could be a little embarrassed with the dysfunctionality that we may be all too personally acquainted with, but man, they sure set the stage, didn't they?
Yeah, and I mean, this type of story would have appeal regardless of the astronomy. And when I found this, I realized that it was a big story, and maybe that's why it was never written. Someone sort of digs and says, well, this is fascinating. It would have been a lot harder to do this, 30, 40 years ago. It's fascinating, but it's not really relevant to astronomy. So I will, whoever decided says, well, there's just not enough there, and drops it. But it wasn't until I found the kidnapping story, once I had the names of the son-in-laws, then I could dig, and then the murder comes up.
Yeah.
And then it's all hands on deck. But that's probably part of the problem. When I found it originally, I was unsure if I could write it in the Journal of the Rast, because it's really not an astronomy story.
Well, maybe, but astronomy is still very much a human enterprise with blood, sweat, and tears, and the humanity is what helps make the history so interesting, doesn't it? And I bet a lot of people listening believe that this turmoil certainly must have hurt the ability for the Clark Corporation to continue to progress as smoothly as they might have otherwise, had it not been, for gun battles and stuff, target practice. So again, I'm so grateful for your presentation, and I'm sure many are.
Thank you. It seems to me that with the death of Alvan Clark, that it couldn't go anywhere anyways. But they seem to. It's clear that London deserves the credit, at least for the lens making part of it. The business end of it, I don't know. But it looks like, at least in the early part of the 20th century, they were still doing good work.
Yeah, Carl. I've understood that from people, a couple people I knew that actually remembered having visited the Clark factory before it was torn down. People like Burton Fitzgerald, Ken Lowney knew him too, a number of us in the Antique Telescope Society. But anyway, we understand that the name was pronounced Lundeen. So Carl Lundeen and his son Robert, they were quite expert opticians, at least when it came to making lenses, although there were some big mirrors eventually made too. And a lot of people believe that Carl Lundeen, the father, was really responsible for a great deal of the success of the Yerkes lens and many of the other big lenses, because of course Alvan Graham was getting very elderly and probably sitting in the corner while Carl was really the hands-on guy with the strength of his younger years.
Right.
But it's all still very fascinating to all of us.
Yeah, and as you can imagine, it's hard to differentiate what was fact and what wasn't. and it's still like now there's more. As I said, I wrote this 6 years ago, and when I was trying to update it a little bit, there was a lot more information there, but it's in tiny little pieces. A lot more newspapers are online. Some of them come from Cambridge newspapers, as you might expect, local, like the local lawsuits and things like that. But the big stuff is all over the country. And as I said, more and more is coming out there. It just takes a lot of time and resources to collect it all and like a jigsaw puzzle, figure it out.
Ken Lowney is in the audience, and it might be Ken. Do you want to join this live? Because you did make some interesting comments there.
Okay.
Oh, there he is. Anyways, you can unmute yourself.
I'm unmuting.
Great. I can.
I think I've unmuted.
Yeah, you are.
Oh, good. Excellent. Yeah, this has long fascinated me because it does make the whole story a little more interesting about the Clarks. And, it had to have had an effect on the future of the business after the unfortunate incident in the backyard there. At the time of the shooting, Alvan Eastman had a son who was 7, and he presumably might have been nearby.
Yeah.
I don't believe that any of the other children of that generation were born other than Beryl Grogan, who was born around 1897. So she'd have been 3.
Yeah.
And Dora Clark, her first daughter was born in 1902.
Okay.
So there may well have been other children because it's a fairly dense neighborhood. And Lundin lived a block away. So he might well have been there as well. So
yeah. Well, I for this story, I decided to keep the children out of it because they were too young. If they had done something or said something that was significant, I certainly would have included it. But I didn't really research them because I knew that they were there, but they were just too young to have been involved in any meaningful way, and it just complicates the story. There's a lot of names being thrown around and stuff.
So it is. I mean, Eastman was at Harvard for a while, but then left and got divorced, and it's an interesting story.
Yeah, and that was part of it. I mean, it wasn't just. Apparently, there was a lot of, or at least some resentment, sort of elitist, that of course he's going to get away with the murder because he's a Harvard guy and all this stuff. There was a bit of that, and one or two editorials where that sentiment came out. Of course, today we have Twitter and Facebook where there'd be thousands or hundreds of thousands of such comments.
This would have been a made-for-TV thing, I'm sure, had it happened recently, because it's, it has all sorts of things. But the question about the motive, if Dora did indeed wind up with everything, and she wasn't there, and Carrie and Lizzie, the 2 sisters who were kind of left to the side, and whose husbands got into a little kerfuffle, a fatal kerfuffle. I don't know where the motive for the finance comes from. So that was the part I could never understand.
Well, I mentioned that. I said it was weird that she may have been there, but as far as a witness is concerned, I can't find her testifying. It doesn't mean she didn't, but she clearly wasn't a bombshell witness.
No, right. I agree, but the two husbands, both of whhom were presumably cut out of the fortune.
Yeah.
Yet they were both working at the firm a little bit. So, you wonder.
Yeah, but that's why I wondered about what was really on the will. That all of that testimony, the giant kidnapping story, came from Sumner Hollander. So he might have been making stuff up to the reporter. Like my wife remembered early on, she said, well, remember the Lindbergh kidnapping, the baby, right?
Right.
So that might have been literally that it clearly wasn't the case, but the other thing is that there was litigation. My understanding is, and I don't know any details, except to say that Richard bought the business. Grogan bought the business outright from the other side by buying them out. But there was a lawsuit about whether they overpaid or underpaid or something. So that went to the courts as well. So the court cases might give some indication that there was financial issues between them, if not the will.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Does Mount Auburn show that they exhumed the body?
Clark, we do have an anonymous question in the Q&A forum here, just asking about the presence of court records. Are there no court records that can further, fill in some of these gaps?
Well, I don't know, but almost certainly if you lived in that area, you could probably search. If they're digital, I don't see them, and one wonders, there must be people who do know if those types of documents still exist around 1901. If they do, then yeah, that would be very helpful. And if it weren't for the newspaper reports of these court proceedings, we wouldn't know. I still wouldn't know that the body was exhumed, for example. So they are valuable. But I think the only way to know for sure is to visit the city, the libraries, and the institutions in Boston, Cambridge, and do some digging. Unless they're online somewhere.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was the other problem. Like the only thing I know about the U.S. justice system, I learned watching OJ, and so I was unaware of that. First of all, I thought that the trial that happened in July, like 2 weeks after the murder, seems awfully fast. And then he's found not guilty, and then they go to a grand jury. I don't know if that's how it works today, and I certainly can't pretend to know how law in Massachusetts was supposed to work.
I think there might have been an inquest, and the inquest would happen. They say, "Oh, there's nothing here. Let's not worry about it." But meanwhile, because you can't get accused, you can't go to trial twice in the U.S. for the same crime.
Double jeopardy.
The double jeopardy thing, but it doesn't sound like they decided there was nothing to write home about, no need to make any charges. And then later they decided, well, maybe not, and looked at it again.
Yeah.
So,
and even at that trial that inquest or whatever in July, the place was packed. Like the people were there ready for it. So there was a lot of interest, at least in the local area of that trial, even that early.
yeah, he was buried 3 days later at Mount Auburn. Grogan was.
Yeah.
So
okay.
They didn't let him cool down much.
No, but and I wonder if the accusation is correct that they secretly exhumed the body in the middle of the night. It would be curious to see what happened to that lawsuit. Was it dropped? Was it settled out of court, or was it frivolous? I don't know. I'm assuming that the body was in fact exhumed, but I don't know that for sure.
I happen to have in front of me, I have the Mount Auburn records for the tomb, and who's buried where and that sort of thing. And it does mention when people go in and then come out and that sort of thing. Because as I think I mentioned on the text, George Bassett Clark's wife decided she wanted to have him buried somewhere else and had him taken away in 1895 and moved to a separate plot for just the two of them.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, nearby. But it doesn't say anything. it, just says Richard H. Grogan Jr., buried on July 7th, 1900, 29 years, 6 months, and 2 days old. But there's no note that, because often what they would do is there'd be notes that say, well, this one now is elsewhere in the cemetery, but doesn't say that. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen, that they didn't just extract him. And
Brought him back a few, maybe.
or not.
Yeah. I don't know if there's any way to know definitively one way or the other that happened. I was at the Mount Auburn cemetery website, and you can stroll through the Google Streets type thing. And I did see the other tomb for George Bassett and his wife separate in the same cemetery, but in their own plot, as are, I believe, Hollanders. But I was also intrigued by some of the other astronomers that are there.
Yeah, and the Lundins are there as well.
Okay. All right.
It is a beautiful cemetery, but a very modest tomb.
Yeah, very much so.
I have a question for the two of you, and I guess for John too, or anyone else. Where would the Clarks have fit into the social stratification in Boston at the time? I mean, clearly they wouldn't have been there with the the Cabot's lodges and Lowell's, but where exactly would they have fit? I mean, I've always had the impression that Clark Sr. Even though he started out practicing as a very, very accomplished miniature painter, but that's not the whole story. They seem to have been. I mean, they were able to send the kids to a very good private school, and that there must have been some wealth elsewhere, but I've always been unclear about this.
Don't know. He was certainly a prominent painter, and he did get royalties for an 1840 patent on the false muzzle. Wesson was paying him $1 a gun, which at the time was a fair amount of money.
That was good money.
Yeah, at the time. So I don't know. He certainly was well read. Wasn't quite the homespun, shucks guy that he's sometimes made out to be. Did work for when they made the first map, the first consolidated map of Massachusetts. Alvan Clark's contributions to it were noted by a guy named Simeon Borden, who was responsible for it, because he showed them how to use a camera lucida to get all the maps of the local maps to the same scale.
Good heavens! So this would be work as a cartographer, a graphic artist.
Yeah, right. So I mean, he
designing calicos.
He was. I'm not sure. I mean, he certainly wasn't in the upper social strata, but I think among
Sarah,
or whatever.
I assume that's Sarah. Did she say he also designed textiles? And calicos and stuff?
In Lowell, yeah.
Yeah, he did.
Cool. Good heavens.
River too, Fall River, in the big mill town in southeastern Massachusetts. And one can imagine that his general genius must have been recognized and appreciated at many social levels. And but perhaps more than that, we can only speculate what it was like.
Yeah, he was a member of the Cambridge Athenaeum, which is it's not the Lowells and Cabot's kind of thing, but for Cambridge was a good, it was a lot of the Harvard folks and others met there.
Right.
Yeah, so you'd want rich people, but the rich people would want clever people about it.
Yes, sir.
But it's clear that he was respected by that class of people. Like,
Oh, yeah, I would say.
question of that. I point out, I believe Alvan Clark Sr.'s wife was related to, his name was Willard, was related to a former president of Harvard. I don't know if that's true or not. There was a
I
Willard.
think that is true.
Yeah, well, that's a good indication. Yeah.
So the pedigree, I mean, obviously, I don't know about the wellhead, I know nothing about it, but clearly he was respected. Not just you know, in a public way, but privately. I have no doubt that there was great respect for the man's work.
Are there many surviving? Of course, I could get off my seat and go look at the second edition of Artists in Optics. But anyways, are there many surviving manuscript drawings of lens layouts and stuff by the Clarks, or even mechanical stuff? Because I haven't seen many. Not if that means anything.
I don't know, actually. I mean, there are certainly some blueprints and the like that were done at the factory, but might well have been done by other workers, you know, certainly later on. I don't have any myself.
Not yet, Ken.
Well, no, we have some of his portrait sketches and things, as John Briggs does as well. And
I didn't know John had those. Well, okay, question for John and Ken. The portraits sketches, I didn't notice many astronomers in there. A few scientists, but not many. Are there any astronomers who they actually?
Well, I have a pen and ink drawing of Dawes. William
Cool. Of course, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
That's, good heavens, I've never seen that. That's not in the book, is it?
I think it might be in Artists in Optics, actually. I think it's in there somewhere. Yeah, and it's of a tint that makes you imagine he might have painted it from a daguerreotype or something. Although he did go and visit there, so
that's right. I mean, that's the usual traditional. I mean, you're right, Clark. I think you're right to bring up the accidental discovery of Sirius B. But before that, it was actually being adopted by Dawes, and then really having that door open to the upper echelons of the British astronomical establishment, which I think that was fairly early on, 60s, 1860s, I think.
In 50s even, yeah.
50s even. So that's the thing that made them, I think.
I think it did. I think he was more appreciated over in England than here, I would think, to some extent. Because he does, there are records and there are letters in the Harvard archives of Bond. I guess he used to pester Bond, trying to get him to give an opinion on a reflector he was making. And there was one letter where I can't quote it from memory quite, but basically it was very clear that Bond was getting tired of this, because I think maybe they weren't very good at first. And he was complaining that he's going to think it's something wonderful once again. And oh man, obviously Bond came around and decided that actually this guy was pretty good. But initially, I think he was more of a pest. But anyway, I've enjoyed this immensely, and thank you, Clark.
Well, thank you. It was a lot of fun to do, and as I said, I wrote about it quite a while ago. So when we started this series, Randall thought that it might be worth doing it, especially with the theme being the history of astronomy. So, and as I said, there's a lot of stuff out there, and it's not an easy thing to fine tune some of these unanswered questions.
Well,
Because you only find little bits here and there.
Yeah, very worthwhile.
A bunch of them together.
What was that?
I said,
Okay.
you pulled a bunch of them together, and I think it's wonderful. You know, the little snippets and little 2-inch columns in
Yeah.
newspapers and things, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, there may be, you know, sooner or later there's going to, and that's interesting about the records. The court records would be an excellent source to find out what's going on. I don't know if there would be any, whether wills would be private documents that are gone forever, or if there's if they are disputed, maybe they're in the court record somewhere. I have no idea. But that was,
Actually, there was a guy, Chuck Bloomsack, died a number of years ago now, was an Antique Telescope Society member and avid Clark follower. And he was an attorney, and he had copies of all of the wills.
okay.
I know that, but I don't know whether he ever gave them to me or not. I need to, now after this talk, I need to go back and look and see what I might have. I'll certainly let you know if there's anything, you know, that would shed any light on this. It does seem a little odd that they would cut the two of the daughters out so significantly.
The claim in that long article, and I didn't share everything, was that Alvan Clark was disappointed with the daughters, perhaps their choice of husbands or some other personal vendetta, but that does seem extreme to react that way. And once again, I don't know if it's even accurate, because it was all coming from the one son-in-law, the whole story. And you just might have, obviously something's amiss, but how severe it is, I don't know. You know.
You can imagine the dissatisfaction with Grogan, the stable hands son, but a Harvard professor.
Yeah,
Seems, like that's a step laterally or up. So
there's
it's a great soap opera going on here.
You got to sell this to Netflix.
Well, the Netflix is filled with these things. I mean, there's Forensic Files, which has like 400 episodes, all murders, and but somehow this hasn't come up. There's no witnesses alive to interview, I suppose. But
yeah, regrettably, in this country, there's about 400 murders a day. So, yeah, they have a lot to pick through.
Anyways, I really appreciate this, Clark. You've done what I couldn't have done. So
well, thank you, and I'm sorry for the technical glitch. We tested it and said, yeah, I can see the screen, and then when I tried again, I think I know what happened, but I couldn't figure out how to fix it. There's a way to flip the monitors, and when you're presenting and stuff. But anyways,
it was a few moments there, not a serious distraction. But again,
it was
yes,
worth waiting for. It's fine.
Exactly. So yes, I'd like to thank you, Clark, for a fantastic presentation. This was normally you're the one that's thanking a guest at the end of one of the history talks, but turnabout seems fair play, and thank you for this, and thanks also to our special guests John and Ken for joining in and providing their insights to this. Excellent suggestions, Randall, for bringing them up to the panel.
Yeah, and Sarah too.
Of course, yes, it's Sarah as well.
Who's
Sorry.
the Wheatland curator at Harvard.
Yes.
No, I learn a lot about the Clarks from my dear husband here, who, entertains me with such murder stories. And, samplers by Clark's wife and, work and all kinds of stuff. So.
Yeah, I had the advantage of living near the factory and, and also knowing people like Burton Fitzgerald and keeping an eye out on auction notices and the like. So that's how I wound up.
well, Just one, one last thought I had is the original, you can check the Google Streets of the original site, and the back end of it where the manufacturing plant was is just a giant parking lot. Is there any possibility that the original mount of either the observatory or the tester mount is still underneath the parking lot? Because I can't imagine they'd be too eager to pull that out if they didn't need to.
No, unfortunately, yeah, when the factory was torn down in the 30s, they built a building that later Polaroid took over, leased from MIT, who owned the land. It became Polaroid's optical shop, and so Polaroid camera lenses and everything were designed and made there, and the factory, the Ford factory, was used for a number of years to manufacture SX70 shutters and things for Polaroid. And I worked for Polaroid for many years, and there was, in that building, there was an elevator that was, this was Henry Ford's doing, no doubt, that actually they would take freight cars in, and they could lift them up to any one of the 5 floors.
Wow.
It was a gigundous, the biggest elevator I've ever seen, that had railroad tracks in it, and could lift up and down. But they moved out of there by the 20s. They weren't there that long.
Yeah.
So so go figure. And what has happened since, the factory was torn down in the 30s, and the Polaroid optical shop was also torn down, but on either side of it, the land was excavated to build a building on Henry Street, which is the street that if you head over towards Hastings Park, the park you pointed out, that corner, that whole land was owned by the Clarks at one time. But when the building was torn down, they excavated and dug down. So I don't think anything really survives, because they lowered the level to be level with the parking lot behind.
Okay.
And so, when they were digging up, when they tore down the Polaroid building, which dated from the late 30s, early 40s, I was over there looking for red bricks and didn't see anything. So I don't think, it's a shame, but I don't think anything of that really survives.
Yeah.
And there's not even any marking of it, unfortunately. There's markings, there's signs that commemorate the factory several blocks away, and there's even a Clark building that was developed by MIT in the 80s, but named after Alvan Clark. But there's no signs or anything at this point.
Well,
So,
the picture that I used in the first slide was, it showed the shop with the tester tube and a couple of probably Model Ts. That was taken, I believe, in the photograph was in an article in 1921 or 22, and the argument with the whole premise of the article was to try and preserve the site as because of the historic interest, and presumably it failed, and
right.
there must have been some talk of demolishing it or selling it at that year, even though it survived another until the 30s.
Yeah, it did. They widened Brookline Street where the 2 houses that the 3 Clark families, if you will, lived in. Those were torn down in order to widen Brookline Street.
Right.
So, the whole area is unrecognizable, really.
Okay. That I didn't know that, but I saw a picture just recently of that Ford factory being built, and it's almost complete. It's just got the windows aren't in and stuff like that. And from the angle that you can see on the one side a house in the background, and it it's the right spot potentially that it would be the Clark building, the Clark house.
Yeah.
It's possible. It's in the right area. Not that photograph was from 1912 or 1913. I believe the factory opened in 1914. So there's still weird sources like that too.
Yeah, there aren't that many photos of the factory building.
No, there's very few.
Unfortunately. And I've gone to the Cambridge Historical Commission, so I was living in Cambridge, and looked at all of their records and everything. And they have very few photographs of the factory or buildings, pretty much nothing that I didn't already have.
That's surprising. You'd think there'd be a lot of them. But just because of the nature of the, it's people building telescopes and you think
Sure.
cameras and things like that. But anyways, Phil, do we want to call that a wrap?
Sure. So yes, once again, thank you to our presenter, Clark, to the rest of the panel, including our special guest panelists. And thank you to everyone who tuned in this evening, coming out for a bit of murder and mayhem on a Tuesday night. We always appreciate getting a good crowd out for these historical talks, and we had another one tonight. So thanks to everyone for making this possible through your patronage.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Randall.
Thanks, Clark.
Yeah, thanks for this.
Some have asked from the question and answer, by the way, about whether we preserve these. And yes, we are simulcasting this to YouTube. It will be on the RASC YouTube channel. We may even get around to in the next couple of days going through and doing a bit of quick cleanup on it. We'll try to get that done as well. So,
and we'll have one next month, I think. We don't know who the speaker is going to be, but you can go to the RASC website and look at the calendar, and hopefully we'll have something for you. Every month I'm trying to, we never know who's going to be the next speaker, and so far we've had some very good ones. So I look forward to seeing you at those in the future. Thanks.
Thanks again, everyone, and good evening.